The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Kensington Palace as Kate Middleton stood before the ornate mirror in her private dressing room. Her reflection showed a woman who had learned to carry herself with grace under the most difficult circumstances, but today, something was different. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the pearl necklace that had been a wedding gift from the Queen Mother's collection. 3 years had passed since she became the Princess of Wales, and the weight of that title had never felt heavier than it did this morning. The newspapers scattered across her vanity told a story she was all too familiar with, headlines that dissected her every move, her fashion choices, her interactions with the press, and, most painfully, her relationship with her stepmother-in-law, Queen Camilla. Kate picked up one of the papers, her eyes scanning the cruel words that had become a daily torment. Princess Catherine fails to measure up to royal standards, read one headline. Another declared, Camilla concerned about Catherine's public behavior. The articles were filled with unnamed sources, palace insiders who claimed to know the intimate details of royal family dynamics. What hurt most was not the criticism itself, but the growing realization that these stories were not appearing by accident. Someone within the palace walls was feeding information to the press, painting Kate in an unfavorable light while elevating Camilla's position as the wise, experienced queen who was trying to guide her difficult daughter-in-law. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made Kate quickly fold the newspapers and place them in a drawer. She had learned to hide her pain, to present a composed face to the world, even when her heart was breaking. This morning, however, would test that resolve in ways she never imagined. Prince William had left early for a series of engagements in Scotland, leaving Kate to face what promised to be a challenging day alone. The royal family was gathering for the quarterly planning meeting, where the senior royals would discuss upcoming events, public appearances, and the general direction of the monarchy's public relations efforts. Kate made her way through the palace corridors, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. Portraits of past monarchs gazed down at her from their gilded frames, their faces stern and judgmental. She wondered what they would make of the current situation, of the subtle warfare being waged within the family that had once seemed so welcoming. The meeting was to be held in the blue drawing room, a space that Kate had always found intimidating with its high ceilings and formal atmosphere. As she approached the door, she could already hear voices from within. King Charles's deep baritone mixed with Camilla's lighter tones, and there was something about their conversation that made Kate pause before entering. The situation with Catherine is becoming increasingly problematic, she heard Camilla saying, her voice carrying clearly through the partially open door. The press coverage has been quite negative, and I'm concerned about the impact on the monarchy's reputation. Kate's heart began to race. They were discussing her, making decisions about her future without her input. She pressed herself closer to the wall, knowing she should announce her presence, but unable to stop herself from listening. Perhaps we need to consider scaling back some of her public engagements, Charles replied, his tone measured but firm. The last thing we need is more negative publicity. I've been thinking the same thing, Camilla agreed. Some of the younger royals simply don't understand the gravity of their positions. They think it's about personal fulfillment rather than duty to the crown. The words hit Kate like physical blows. After 3 years of dedicating herself completely to royal duties, of sacrificing her own desires and ambitions for the good of the monarchy, she was being characterized as someone who didn't understand her responsibilities. She thought of all the late nights spent studying briefing papers, the countless hours of preparation for each public appearance, the way she had transformed herself from a middle-class girl into someone who could represent the crown with dignity. None of that seemed to matter to the people on the other side of the door. Taking a deep breath, Kate pushed open the door and entered the room. Charles and Camilla were seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, their heads close together in conversation. They looked up as she entered, and Kate caught something in their expressions, a fleeting moment of surprise, perhaps even guilt, before their faces settled into polite smiles. "Catherine, darling," Charles said, rising from his seat. "We were just discussing the agenda for today's meeting." Kate nodded, managing a smile of her own. "I apologize for being late. I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all," Camilla said, though there was something cool in her voice. "We were just getting started." As Kate took her seat at the table, she noticed that the papers in front of Charles and Camilla were quickly shuffled away. Whatever they had been discussing in such detail was not meant for her eyes. The realization that she was being excluded from decisions that directly affected her life was like a knife twisting in her chest. The meeting officially began with a discussion of upcoming state visits and ceremonial events. Kate participated as expected, offering input on charitable initiatives and public engagement strategies. But underneath her professional demeanor, anger was building. Every suggestion she made was met with polite consideration that ultimately led nowhere. Every idea was subtly redirected or postponed for further discussion at a later date. It became clear that this meeting was not about collaboration or planning. It was about control, about making sure she understood her place in the carefully constructed hierarchy of the royal family. Camilla, who had once been the outsider fighting for acceptance, had now become the insider working to maintain her position at any cost. The breaking point came when Charles brought up the upcoming Children's Hospital Charity Gala, an event that Kate had been planning for months. She had worked closely with the hospital administrators, the charity organizers, and even the celebrity guests who would be attending. It was exactly the kind of meaningful, impact-driven event that she had hoped to make her signature as Princess of Wales. "I've been thinking," Charles said, looking directly at Kate, "that perhaps Camilla should take the lead on the Children's Hospital Gala. She has more experience with these types of high-profile charity events." Kate felt the air leave her lungs. Months of work, months of preparation, months of building relationships with the people involved, all of it was being taken away with a single sentence. "I've already committed significant time to this project," Kate said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "The organizers are expecting me to be the primary royal patron." Of course, Camilla interjected smoothly, "And your work has been invaluable. I'm simply suggesting that I could provide additional support, given the high-profile nature of the event." The words were diplomatic, but Kate understood their true meaning. This was not about support or collaboration. This was about replacing her entirely, about making sure that any success or positive publicity from the event would be credited to Camilla rather than to her. "The Queen has extensive experience with medical charities," Charles added, using Camilla's new title with emphasis. Her involvement would add gravitas to the occasion. Kate looked around the table, seeing the faces of people she had tried so hard to please, people she had hoped would eventually accept her as family. Instead, she saw calculation, political maneuvering, and a cold determination to maintain the existing power structure regardless of the cost to her personally. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful diplomacy. Kate responded when spoken to, offered opinions when asked, and maintained a facade of cooperative engagement. But inside, something fundamental was shifting. The loyal daughter-in-law, who had always put the family's needs before her own, was beginning to question whether that loyalty was deserved or even appreciated. As the meeting concluded and the others began to gather their papers, Kate remained seated. The weight of 3 years of suppressed frustration, of always being the understanding one, of constantly adapting herself to meet other people's expectations, was becoming unbearable. "Catherine," Charles said, noticing her stillness, "are you quite all right?" Kate looked up at him, this man who would be king, who had welcomed her into the family with warmth and promises of support. She saw the concern in his eyes, but she also saw the determination that had allowed him to make the decisions that benefited Camilla at her expense. "I'm fine," she said quietly, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. But she wasn't fine. Nothing about this situation was fine. And as she finally rose from her chair and made her way toward the door, Kate realized that something inside her was breaking. The careful composure she had maintained for so long was beginning to crack, and she wasn't sure she could hold it together much longer. The afternoon stretched ahead of her with its scheduled appearances and royal duties. But Kate found herself questioning everything. Was this what her life would always be? A series of carefully orchestrated public performances, while the real decisions were made behind closed doors by people who saw her as a threat rather than an ally? As she walked through the palace corridors, past the portraits of queens who had come before her, Kate wondered if any of them had felt this same sense of isolation, this same crushing weight of expectation combined with powerlessness to control their own destiny. The seeds of the crisis that would soon unfold had been planted in that moment of realization. Kate Middleton, the woman who had given up everything to serve the crown, was beginning to understand that her service might never be enough, that her position in the royal family would always be subject to the whims and insecurities of others. And somewhere in the depths of her carefully controlled emotions, anger was beginning to grow, anger that would soon demand an outlet. Anger that would transform the composed princess into a woman pushed beyond her breaking point. The storm was coming, and when it finally broke, it would shake the very foundations of the modern monarchy. The days following the devastating meeting in the blue drawing room passed like scenes from a carefully choreographed play. Kate continued her royal duties with the same outward grace she had always shown, but those closest to her began to notice subtle changes. Her smiles seemed more forced, her responses more measured, and there was a new tension in her shoulders that no amount of royal training could completely disguise. William returned from Scotland to find his wife different somehow. She was quieter during their private moments, more distant when they discussed upcoming engagements. When he asked about the family meeting, Kate gave him only the basic details, unwilling to burden him with the full extent of what she had experienced. She knew he was caught between his loyalty to his father and his love for his wife, and she didn't want to force him to choose. But the pressure was building, and Kate could feel it in every interaction with the royal household. The staff, always sensitive to the shifting dynamics of palace politics, had begun treating her with a subtle deference that felt more like pity than respect. They knew, as palace staff always seemed to know, that her position was becoming precarious. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala, once her proudest project, had been systematically stripped away from her. Phone calls that should have come to her office were redirected to Camilla's team. Meetings she had scheduled were canceled and rescheduled without her knowledge. The charity organizers, confused by the mixed signals from the palace, began expressing their concerns through carefully worded emails that Kate read with growing humiliation. Dr. Sarah Matthews, the chief administrator of the Children's Hospital, had worked with Kate for months to plan the event. She was a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for sick children, and she had been genuinely excited to partner with someone who shared her passion for the cause. When Kate's involvement began to diminish without explanation, Dr. Matthews reached out directly. "Your Royal Highness," she said during a phone conversation that Kate took in the privacy of her study, "I hope you don't mind my calling directly, but we're getting some mixed messages from the palace about the gala arrangements." Kate closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache in her chest that had become her constant companion. "I understand there have been some changes to the planning committee," she said carefully. "Yes, and while we're certainly honored to have Her Majesty the Queen's involvement, we had specifically structured this event around your vision for interactive exhibits that would allow the royal patron to engage directly with the children and their families." The irony was painful. Kate had spent weeks developing those interactive exhibits, working with child psychologists and play therapists to create experiences that would bring joy to children facing serious medical challenges. It was exactly the kind of hands-on, meaningful engagement that she had hoped would define her role as Princess of Wales. "I'm sure the Queen will bring her own perspective to the event," Kate managed to say, though the words felt like betrayals of her own work and dedication. "Of course," Dr. Matthews replied, but there was disappointment in her voice that Kate pretended not to hear. After ending the call, Kate sat alone in her study, surrounded by the research materials and planning documents she had assembled for the gala. Months of work reduced to irrelevance by a few sentences in a family meeting. The waste of it all, the wasted effort, the wasted relationships, the wasted opportunities to make a real difference was almost more than she could bear. The breaking point was accelerating toward her, though she didn't realize it yet. Each small humiliation, each subtle dismissal, each moment of being treated as an obstacle rather than an asset, was building towards something that would change everything. The crisis began to crystallize during what should have been a routine event, the opening of a new wing at the National Portrait Gallery. It was exactly the kind of cultural engagement that Kate enjoyed, an opportunity to combine her interest in the arts with her royal duties. She had been scheduled to attend alone, which had become increasingly rare as Camilla's team worked to ensure the Queen's presence at high-profile events. Kate arrived at the gallery to find photographers and reporters gathered in numbers that seemed unusual for what should have been a relatively modest cultural event. Something was happening, though she couldn't immediately identify what it was. The gallery director, James Ashworth, greeted her with his usual warmth, but Kate noticed he seemed nervous, checking his phone frequently and glancing toward the entrance as if expecting someone else to arrive. "Is everything all right, James?" Kate asked as they made their way through the gallery toward the new wing. "Yes, of course, Your Royal Highness," he replied, but his answer lacked conviction. There have been some last-minute additions to the guest list." Kate felt a familiar sinking sensation in her stomach. Additions? Before James could answer, there was a commotion at the entrance. Kate turned to see Camilla arriving with her own entourage, dressed in an elegant outfit that was perfectly coordinated for maximum photogenic impact. The Queen's presence immediately shifted the entire dynamic of the event. The photographers who had been politely documenting Kate's arrival and early interactions suddenly became animated. Camera flashes erupted in rapid succession as Camilla made her way through the gallery, stopping to speak with guests and pose for photos. Kate found herself relegated to the background, watching as her own event was transformed into something entirely different. What followed was a masterclass in royal protocol and media manipulation. Camilla moved through the gallery with practiced ease, making all the right comments, asking all the right questions, and positioning herself perfectly for the photographers who seemed to anticipate her every move. Kate, meanwhile, found herself increasingly marginalized, included in conversations only when protocol demanded it. The most humiliating moment came during the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new wing. Kate had been told she would be performing this honor, but as they approached the ceremonial area, James Ashworth quietly informed her that there had been a change of plans. "Her Majesty the Queen will be performing the ribbon cutting," he said apologetically. "I hope you understand, given her seniority." Kate nodded graciously, as she had been trained to do, but inside she was crumbling. This was her event, her engagement, her opportunity to represent the crown in an area where she had genuine expertise and passion. Yet once again, she was being pushed aside, rendered invisible by the mere presence of someone whose position gave her the power to take whatever she wanted. Standing beside Camilla, as the Queen cut the ribbon, Kate smiled for the cameras and applauded at the appropriate moments. But behind her composed exterior, something fundamental was breaking. The accumulated weight of months of subtle humiliations, of being treated as disposable, of watching her work and dedication being casually dismissed, was becoming unbearable. As they moved through the rest of the event, Kate noticed how differently people responded to Camilla compared to how they responded to her. There was a deference to the Queen that went beyond mere protocol. It was the recognition of real power, real influence within the royal family. Kate, despite her title and her genuine commitment to her role, was increasingly seen as someone whose position was temporary, contingent on the goodwill of others. The media coverage that evening confirmed what Kate had suspected. The headlines focused entirely on Camilla's surprise appearance and her gracious opening of the new gallery wing. Kate was mentioned only in passing, identified simply as also in attendance. Years of building relationships with cultural institutions, of developing expertise in arts patronage, reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. That night, as Kate sat in her private sitting room reviewing the day's events, she realized that something had changed irrevocably. The careful balance she had maintained between her own needs and the demands of royal life was no longer sustainable. She was disappearing, being systematically erased from her own life, and no amount of dignity or restraint was going to stop it. The phone call that would trigger the final crisis came 2 days later. Kate was reviewing briefing materials for an upcoming visit to a women's shelter when her private secretary, Emma Harrison, knocked on her door with an expression that immediately put Kate on alert. "Your Royal Highness," Emma said carefully, "I've just received a call from the Palace Press Office. There's going to be an announcement about some changes to the royal engagement calendar." Kate set down her papers, already knowing that whatever Emma was about to tell her would be devastating. What kind of changes? The Children's Hospital Gala has been restructured. Her Majesty the Queen will now be the sole royal patron for the event. The press release is going out this afternoon. The words hung in the air between them, and Kate felt something inside her chest crack open. This wasn't just about a single event anymore. This was about her entire future, her entire identity as a working member of the royal family. If they could take away her most important project this easily, what was to stop them from taking away everything else? "I see," Kate said quietly, her voice carefully controlled despite the storm raging inside her. "There's more," Emma continued reluctantly. "Several of your other patronages are being reviewed for possible consolidation with existing royal interests." Translation: more of her work would be transferred to Camilla. More of her identity as Princess of Wales would be stripped away, piece by piece, until she was left with nothing but empty ceremonial functions and meaningless ribbon cuttings. Kate dismissed Emma and sat alone in her office, staring out the window at the palace gardens where tourists gathered hopefully for a glimpse of royal life. They had no idea of the warfare being conducted behind these elegant facades, the way power was wielded and lives destroyed with polite smiles and careful press releases. The anger that had been building for months was now threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She thought of all the people she would be letting down: Dr. Matthews at the Children's Hospital, the charity workers who had trusted her with their causes, the young women who looked to her as an example of how to navigate difficult circumstances with grace. But most of all, she thought about herself. The Kate Middleton who had entered this family with such hope and determination, ready to serve and sacrifice for something greater than herself. That woman was being systematically destroyed, and Kate was beginning to realize that her only choice was to fight back or disappear entirely. The final confrontation was now inevitable. The careful restraint that had characterized her response to months of manipulation was about to shatter, and when it did, the explosion would be heard throughout the monarchy. The stage was set for a reckoning that would force everyone involved to confront the true cost of the power games they had been playing. The morning of the confrontation dawned gray and overcast, as if the weather itself sensed the storm that was about to break within the walls of Kensington Palace. Kate woke early, having spent most of the night staring at the ceiling while William slept peacefully beside her. She had made a decision during those long, dark hours. She could no longer pretend that everything was acceptable, that she could continue to smile graciously while being systematically diminished. The immediate trigger came in the form of a newspaper article that appeared in the Daily Telegraph that morning. Kate discovered it when her lady-in-waiting, Sophie, brought her the morning papers with her tea. The headline read, "Queen Camilla takes leadership role in royal children's charities." The article detailed how the Queen had assumed patronage of several children's charities, including the Children's Hospital, as part of her expanding role within the monarchy. But it wasn't just the facts that devastated Kate. It was the quotes attributed to palace sources that painted her as someone who had been struggling with the demands of her charitable work, someone who was grateful for Her Majesty's guidance and support in managing her patronages more effectively. The implication was clear. Kate was incompetent, overwhelmed, and in need of rescue by the more experienced Camilla. Months of dedicated work, successful fundraising, and genuine connections with the causes she served were being rewritten as failures that required intervention from above. Kate set down the newspaper with trembling hands. This was no longer about competition or protocol. This was about destroying her reputation and credibility. The article would be read by every major donor, every charity administrator, every volunteer who had worked with her. Her professional relationships, built carefully over 3 years, were being poisoned by deliberate misinformation. She knew she had to act, but the royal family's cardinal rule was that disputes should never become public. Everything was supposed to be handled privately, diplomatically, with careful attention to maintaining the monarchy's image of unity and stability. But Kate was beginning to understand that this rule only applied to people in her position. Those with real power seemed free to manipulate the press whenever it served their interests. The family meeting that had been called for that afternoon was originally supposed to address the upcoming Commonwealth tour, but Kate knew it would inevitably touch on the recent changes to the charity patronages. She spent the morning preparing not just for a discussion, but for what might be her final stand as a working member of the royal family. William had already left for his morning engagements, and Kate was grateful for the time alone to compose herself. She dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that conveyed both professionalism and authority. She applied her makeup with extra care, knowing that any sign of distress would be interpreted as weakness by people who were already questioning her suitability for royal life. As she made her way to the meeting room, Kate passed the portrait gallery that lined the main corridor of the palace. The faces of past royal consorts looked down at her from their gilded frames. Some who had thrived in their roles, others who had been broken by the pressures of royal life. She wondered which category history would place her in, assuming she lasted long enough to become a historical figure at all. The meeting was being held in the same blue drawing room where the first devastating conversation had taken place weeks earlier. As Kate approached, she could already hear voices from within. Charles's measured tones, Camilla's lighter responses, and what sounded like Princess Anne's characteristic directness. The senior royals were already deep in conversation, and Kate realized she was once again being excluded from the preliminary discussions that would shape whatever decisions were announced to her. Taking a deep breath, she knocked and entered. The conversation stopped abruptly as all eyes turned toward her. Charles, Camilla, and Princess Anne were seated around the mahogany table, with papers spread before them that were quickly covered as Kate took her place. "Catherine," Charles said with his usual formal warmth, "thank you for joining us. We were just discussing the arrangements for the Commonwealth tour." Kate nodded, but she noticed that the papers being hastily covered were press clippings, including, she suspected, the morning's article about Camilla's expanding charitable role. They had been discussing her, planning their response to whatever reaction she might have to the public humiliation she had just endured. The meeting proceeded through various agenda items with painful politeness. Flight arrangements, security protocols, ceremonial gifts, all the mundane details that surrounded royal travel were covered in exhaustive detail. Kate participated when required, but her attention was focused on the undercurrents of tension that flowed beneath the surface of their professional discussion. Finally, Charles brought up the topic that Kate had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "I think we should also discuss the recent reorganization of some charitable patronages," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "There have been some questions from the press about the rationale behind these changes." Kate felt her heart begin to race, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, the usual speculation," Camilla interjected smoothly. "Journalists trying to create drama where none exists. I think the coverage has been quite positive overall, don't you? The focus on streamlining our charitable efforts to maximize impact." The casual dismissal of Kate's humiliation was the final straw. For months, she had absorbed criticism, accepted diminishment, and swallowed her pride in service to the greater good. But she would not sit quietly while Camilla characterized the destruction of her professional reputation as a positive development. "I'm not sure positive is the word I would use," Kate said, her voice carrying an edge that made everyone in the room look up sharply. Charles cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Catherine, I think what Camilla means, I know what Camilla means," Kate interrupted, the careful control she had maintained for so long finally beginning to crack. "Just as I know who the palace sources were in this morning's Telegraph article." The silence that followed was deafening. Princess Anne's eyebrows rose slightly. She had always respected directness, even when it was inconvenient. Charles looked genuinely surprised by Kate's uncharacteristic bluntness. But it was Camilla's reaction that revealed the most. A flicker of something that might have been satisfaction quickly masked by an expression of hurt confusion. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Camilla said carefully. Kate looked around the table at these people who had the power to reshape her life with a few casual decisions. The anger that had been building for months was now demanding release, and she was no longer able or willing to contain it. "I'm not implying anything," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm stating clearly that my work with the Children's Hospital and other charities has been systematically undermined, that my professional relationships have been damaged by deliberate misinformation, and that I have been excluded from decisions that directly affect my role as Princess of Wales." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Princess Anne watched the proceedings with the interest of someone observing a particularly fascinating social experiment. "Catherine," Charles said carefully, "if you have concerns about how these transitions have been handled, transitions?" Kate's voice rose slightly, and she could feel her composure finally beginning to shatter. "These aren't transitions, Charles. This is sabotage. This is a deliberate campaign to undermine my position within this family and my credibility with the public." Camilla's mask of concerned confusion was beginning to slip. "I think you're being rather dramatic, Catherine. These are simply practical adjustments to ensure that our charitable work is as effective as possible." "Effective for whom?" Kate shot back. "Because from where I'm sitting, the only thing these adjustments have accomplished is transferring successful programs from my patronage to yours while making me look incompetent in the process." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Royal family members simply did not speak to each other this way, particularly not in formal settings. But Kate had moved beyond caring about protocol. 3 years of careful diplomacy had gotten her nothing but humiliation and marginalization. "I have worked tirelessly to build relationships with these organizations," she continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of her accumulated frustration. "I have spent countless hours learning about their needs, developing programs that make a real difference in people's lives. And now I'm supposed to smile graciously while watching all of that work be credited to someone else." Charles was looking increasingly uncomfortable, caught between his wife and his daughter-in-law in a confrontation he had clearly hoped to avoid. "Perhaps we could discuss this more privately." "No," Kate said firmly. "I'm tired of private discussions where decisions are made behind closed doors and then presented to me as fait accompli. I'm tired of reading about my own life in the newspapers instead of being included in the conversations that affect my future." Princess Anne, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "What exactly are you asking for, Catherine?" The question was direct and challenging, but Kate detected a note of genuine interest in Anne's voice. The Princess Royal had never been one to tolerate political games or indirect communication. "I'm asking to be treated as a full member of this family instead of a temporary placeholder," Kate said, meeting Anne's gaze directly. "I'm asking for my work to be respected and my contributions to be acknowledged. And I'm asking for the sabotage to stop." Camilla's composure finally cracked completely. "Sabotage? How dare you accuse me of sabotage? I have done nothing but try to help you navigate the complexities of royal life. If you can't handle the responsibilities that come with your position, don't," Kate interrupted, her voice now carrying a dangerous edge. Don't you dare suggest that I can't handle my responsibilities. I have handled everything that has been thrown at me with grace and dedication. What I can't handle is being stabbed in the back by someone who should be supporting me. The confrontation had escalated beyond anything Charles had imagined possible. His face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, and Kate could see him struggling to maintain control of a situation that was spiraling rapidly out of his reach. "This is completely unacceptable," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I will not have this kind of discord within the family. Catherine, I think you need to reconsider your tone." But Kate was beyond caring about consequences. The careful facade she had maintained for 3 years was crumbling, and all the pain and frustration she had suppressed was pouring out. "My tone," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're concerned about my tone? What about the tone of the press coverage that makes me look like an incompetent amateur? What about the tone of the palace briefings that suggest I'm grateful to be rescued from my own charitable work?" Tears were beginning to form in her eyes, but they were tears of rage rather than sadness. She had reached the point where emotional control was no longer possible. "I came into this family with nothing but good intentions," she continued, her voice trembling with the effort of containing her emotions. "I gave up my career, my independence, my privacy. I transformed myself into someone I thought you wanted me to be. And for what? So that I could be treated as disposable the moment it became convenient." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Kate's ragged breathing. She looked around the table at the faces of people who had the power to destroy her life with a few strategic decisions, people who had chosen to see her as a threat rather than an asset. The breaking point had finally arrived, and there was no going back. Whatever happened next would determine not just Kate's future within the royal family, but the very nature of relationships within the modern monarchy. The storm that had been building for months was about to reach its full fury, and no one in that room was prepared for the devastation it would leave in its wake. The explosion came without warning, though perhaps it should have been expected. Kate's carefully controlled facade finally shattered completely as the full weight of months of suppressed emotion broke free. The tears that had been threatening throughout the confrontation suddenly began to flow, and once they started, they seemed impossible to stop. "I can't do this anymore," she said through her tears, her voice breaking with the weight of everything she had endured. "I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. I can't keep smiling while my life is being dismantled piece by piece." The sight of the Princess of Wales crying uncontrollably in a formal royal meeting was something none of them had experienced before. Charles sat frozen in his chair, clearly unprepared for this level of emotional breakdown. Princess and looked uncomfortable, but concerned, while Camilla watched with an expression that was difficult to read. "Catherine," Charles said uncertainly, "perhaps you should take a moment to compose yourself." "No." Kate's voice rang out with surprising force despite her tears. "I will not compose myself. I will not pretend anymore that this is acceptable. You want to know what's unacceptable? It's unacceptable that I have to read about my own professional demise in the newspapers. It's unacceptable that my charitable work is being handed over to someone else without my consent. It's unacceptable that I'm being portrayed as incompetent when I've worked harder than anyone in this family to prove myself worthy of my position." Her words were punctuated by sobs that she no longer tried to control. The careful posture, the measured responses, the diplomatic language, all of it was gone, replaced by raw human emotion that filled the elegant room like a storm. "And you," she said, turning to look directly at Camilla through her tears, "you who should understand better than anyone what it feels like to be the outsider, the one fighting for acceptance. You become exactly the kind of person who made your own life difficult when you were trying to find your place in this family." Camilla's face had gone pale. Whatever reaction she had expected from her systematic undermining of Kate's position, this level of emotional devastation was clearly not it. "Catherine, I never intended," Camilla began, but Kate cut her off. "You never intended what? To destroy my credibility? To steal my work? To make me look like a failure?" Kate's voice was becoming hoarse from the combination of crying and shouting, but she couldn't stop. Everything I've lost, you've gained. Every opportunity that's been taken from me has been handed directly to you. If that wasn't intentional, then you're far less intelligent than I thought you were. Charles finally found his voice, and it carried the full authority of his position as king. "That is enough," he said sharply. "Catherine, you are out of line. Camilla has done nothing but try to help you adapt to royal life." The words hit Kate like a physical blow. After everything she had endured, after all the evidence of systematic sabotage, Charles was still defending Camilla. The realization that he was either willfully blind to what was happening or complicit in it pushed Kate's emotional breakdown into entirely new territory. "Help me," she laughed bitterly through her tears. "Is that what we're calling it? Then I'd hate to see what it looks like when she actually tries to hurt someone." Princess, and who had been silently observing the deteriorating situation, finally intervened. "I think," she said in her characteristically direct manner, "that we all need to step back and consider what's actually happening here." Her words carried enough authority to briefly pause the escalating conflict, and looked around the table with the analytical gaze of someone who had spent decades navigating royal family dynamics. "Catherine is clearly in distress," she continued, "and whether or not her specific accusations have merit, the fact that she feels this way suggests that something has gone seriously wrong with how we're handling family relationships." Charles turned to his sister with obvious relief at having an ally in defusing the situation. "And surely you can see that Catherine is overwrought. I can see that she's upset," and replied evenly, "but I can also see that some of her concerns appear to have merit. The handling of the charity patronage changes was poorly managed, and the press coverage has indeed been damaging to Catherine's reputation." Camilla, who had remained relatively silent since Kate's accusation, finally spoke. "I resent the implication that I orchestrated some kind of campaign against Catherine. I have always acted in what I believe to be the best interests of the monarchy." "Your best interests, you mean?" Kate said, her tears still flowing but her voice gaining strength. "Everything you've done has been calculated to enhance your own position while diminishing mine. You've turned my husband's family against me, poisoned my professional relationships, and made me look like a fool in front of the entire country." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Camilla's face flushed with what appeared to be genuine anger for the first time in the conversation. "How dare you?" Camilla said, her own composure finally cracking. "I have worked for decades to earn my place in this family. I have endured criticism, hostility, and public humiliation that you can't even imagine. I will not be lectured about my motives by someone who has never had to fight for anything in her life." "Never had to fight?" Kate's voice rose again, incredulous. "Do you think this has been easy for me? Do you think I haven't faced criticism and hostility? The difference is that mine came from strangers, while yours is coming from family." Charles was now visibly struggling to contain his own anger. The confrontation between the two most important women in his life was everything he had feared and tried to prevent. "This has to stop," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Both of you. This is exactly the kind of internal conflict that undermines everything we're trying to achieve as a family and as an institution." But Kate was beyond caring about institutional concerns. 3 years of institutional loyalty had brought her nothing but pain and humiliation. "You're right," she said, wiping tears from her eyes, but still crying. "This has to stop, but it's not going to stop with me accepting being treated as a second-class member of this family. It's not going to stop with me pretending that everything is fine while my life is being destroyed." She stood up from her chair, her legs unsteady, but her resolve surprisingly firm despite her emotional state. "I came into this family with respect for the institution and genuine affection for the people in it," she said, looking around the table at each of them. "I believed in the work we were doing, the difference we could make. I was prepared to sacrifice everything for that belief." Her voice broke again, but she continued speaking through her tears. "But I won't sacrifice my dignity. I won't sacrifice my self-respect. And I won't sacrifice my sanity to maintain a facade that serves everyone's interests except my own. Charles rose from his chair as well, his face flushed with anger that he was no longer trying to hide. Catherine, if you cannot control yourself, if you cannot conduct yourself with the dignity appropriate to your position, then what? Kate interrupted, her tears still flowing, but her voice carrying a note of defiance that surprised everyone in the room. You'll take away my title? Strip me of my patronages? Release a statement saying I'm unable to fulfill my duties due to personal issues? The suggestions were clearly not random thoughts. They were fears that had been growing in Kate's mind as she watched her position being systematically undermined. Because you're going to do all of that anyway, she continued. This is just the excuse you've been waiting for. The emotional breakdown that proves I'm not suitable for royal life. Camilla, who had been watching Kate's emotional disintegration with what appeared to be growing concern, finally spoke with something approaching her old diplomatic tone. Catherine, no one wants to see you fail. We all want you to succeed in your role. Kate turned to look at Camilla with an expression of pure disbelief, her face still streaked with tears. Do you really expect me to believe that? She asked, her voice hoarse but still carrying conviction. After everything that's happened, you expect me to believe that you want me to succeed? The question seemed to genuinely affect Camilla, who looked away uncomfortably before responding. I know how difficult this transition can be, she said quietly. Perhaps I haven't been as supportive as I should have been. It was the closest thing to an admission of wrongdoing that Kate was likely to get, but it felt too little, too late. The damage had been done, not just to her position within the family, but to her fundamental sense of trust and belonging. Perhaps, Kate repeated bitterly, perhaps you deliberately sabotaged my work. Perhaps you fed negative stories to the press. Perhaps you manipulated family meetings to exclude me from important decisions. She paused, wiping more tears from her eyes before delivering what felt like a final verdict. Perhaps none of that matters anymore, because I can't continue to function in an environment where I have to constantly guard against attacks from people who are supposed to be my allies. The words carried the weight of a resignation, though Kate hadn't explicitly stated her intentions. Princess Anne, who had been silently observing the exchange, leaned forward in her chair. What exactly are you saying, Catherine? Kate looked around the room one final time, taking in the faces of people who held her future in their hands. Charles, flushed with anger and frustration. Camilla, pale and clearly shaken by the confrontation she had helped create. And watching with analytical concern. I'm saying that I don't know if I can continue to be the person you want me to be, Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silent room. I don't know if I can keep pretending that this is sustainable. The admission hung in the air like a conclusion to everything that had come before. Kate's breakdown was complete, her emotional reserves exhausted, her careful composure shattered beyond repair. She had reached the point where the cost of maintaining her position was higher than she was willing or able to pay. Charles stood staring at his daughter-in-law as she cried uncontrollably, finally, understanding the true cost of the family dynamics he had allowed to develop. Camilla looked on with an expression that seemed to mix satisfaction with unexpected remorse. And Princess Anne watched it all with the grim recognition of someone who had seen similar tragedies play out within royal families before. The storm had finally broken, but rather than clearing the air, it had revealed the depth of the damage that had been accumulating beneath the surface. The carefully constructed facade of royal family unity had been shattered, and no one in that room was certain it could ever be repaired. Kate Middleton, the woman who had entered the royal family with such hope and determination, stood crying uncontrollably as the people who were supposed to protect her looked on. The transformation was complete, from composed princess to broken woman, from dedicated family member to someone contemplating escape from a situation that had become unbearable. The monarchy would survive this crisis, as it had survived others before. But the cost would be measured not just in damaged relationships and lost opportunities, but in the human toll of a system that consumed those who served it most faithfully. And as Kate continued to cry, everyone in that room began to understand the true price of the power games they had been playing.